Hey, my name's Tom, and today we're going to talk about Dying Light 2. Dying Light 2 kind of sucks. Thanks for watching. No, seriously, we're going to talk about Dying Light 1, the better game in the series by a mile. It's scarier, it's tougher, there's just years of support and DLC content ripe for the... Just, if you, I don't know if anybody eats fruit like that, but you should eat fruit like that, especially when it comes to Dying Light 1's fruit. Speaking of years of support, one of my favourite additions to Dying Light 1 is when you pause the game to open your inventory and get weapons and whatnot, time doesn't freeze anymore. It's terrifying. Zombies are more aggressive, volatiles you don't see on the radar anymore. And I love games that really offer a challenge, that make you think, that force you to use all the game's mechanics and systems that are put into place to sort of immerse you on a much deeper level. And when you have to loot the environment because you know you're running out of supplies, you're dying, you feel as if you're there. It's a lot more tangible. And today we're going to talk about 7 mods that make an already challenging game demand even more from the player, that really immerse you in the world and firmly cement Dying Light as one of the tensest survival horror games ever made. And the intention isn't to make the game tougher to such a degree that zombies are barely killable or you die in one hit. These mods don't do that, but they maybe enhance the AI of the zombies or make crafting more in depth and force you to explore the environment in ways you've never needed to before, you know, and to push yourself in order to survive. So I really hope that you enjoy this video. Dying Light is a really, really good game. It holds a dear place in my heart. You can't really see my heart because I've got skin and t-shirt and stuff. I wanted to play the game again as if I'd never played it before, and these 7 mods offer a fresh, scarier, tougher, gripping... Oh god, it's really scary with these mods. You're gonna love it.
So I wouldn't recommend it unless you have a death wish.
First and foremost, we have Night Runner mode, or as I refer to it, Dying Light 2.0. Made by Fear, the revered modder responsible for rebalancing Dying Light's Be the Zombie game mode and vastly improving the feeling of Dying Light 2's parkour in a recent update. This mammoth mod, which has been in development for several years, overhauls practically the entire game. The world is now a far more brutal place, filled to the brim with risk versus reward. From the moment you step foot in Haran, you'll immediately notice your health has been halved, and not only that, it won't regenerate at all until you invest in the relevant skill. Speaking of which, each skill tree has been revitalised and reorganised with unique branching paths containing both familiar and brand new skills, along with preview videos highlighting exactly what each skill does. Do beware though that certain abilities have been balanced to make you less overpowered and now have a cooldown before you can reuse them, meaning you can't simply spam instant escapes whenever you get swarmed. These new skill trees offer a lot more freedom in the order you unlock new abilities, and you'll need to utilise every skill in your repertoire to overcome this new nightmare. In fact, Nightmare mode ceases to exist anymore. Every single difficulty has been renamed and rebalanced to offer a harder challenge in a number of innovative ways. Depending on the difficulty you select, volatiles spot you almost instantly, Riser's men arrive at airdrops quicker, the day and night cycle lasts longer, items are more expensive to purchase, loot is harder to come by, and your radar is only visible when standing still. But that is only scratching the surface. Regardless of difficulty level, almost every enemy type has been buffed in one way or another. Now don't worry, enemies aren't suddenly tanks with tons of health. Instead, they now have new tricks up their sleeves. Unlike other zombie types that can sprint, climb and attack you from a distance, your bog standard biter's only ability is to grab you, and Night Runner is well aware of this, doubling down on this tactic and promoting them from simple cannon fodder into a formidable force. Biters now turn to face you and initiate grabs much faster, making them easy to underestimate. And if you're unfortunate enough to get grabbed by this new breed of biter, expect a fight to the death. Button mashing your way out of a grab is considerably tougher, and if you find yourself in a biter's embrace, being overwhelmed is almost inevitable. Now on the other end of the food chain, you have volatiles. Volatiles will now spit acid at you even if they can reach you, making them a danger from any distance. And if that wasn't bad enough, they now close the distance even more efficiently by attempting to pounce on you from much further away. But it doesn't end there. Volatiles are now immune to your survivor sense and cannot be seen through walls, making them the ultimate apex predator. These enhancements aren't just limited to existing enemies, however. Several mini-boss varieties now roam the world, and while they're few and far between, they're the closest thing to a daytime volatile. When you inevitably do get injured, crafting medical supplies, or any blueprint for that matter, is a lot more in depth. Firstly, you'll need to learn the appropriate survival skill before you can even begin crafting, and then you'll need to find a more realistic assortment of components than is required in the vanilla game. Newly implemented crafting boxes are a fundamental component required to create many of the game's blueprints, and are somewhat of a luxury item. They're not super rare, but you won't be crafting an abundance of items back to back, making gameplay a breeze. In fact, the entire loot system has been reworked, with new loot containers such as trees and barrels containing unique components. And items in general are now found in places you'd expect them to be. No longer will Haran's residents store saw blades in laundry baskets, and you'll now need to loot, purchase or craft weapon toolkits before you can repair your weapon, becoming one of the most valuable sought after items in the game. This new depth to blueprint crafting incentivizes you to explore the environment, visit new locations and take on tougher foes, and you'll find yourself interacting with the world on a level you've never needed to before. You will struggle to survive, but numerous tools of the trade have been implemented to even the odds, such as poisonous firecrackers, entirely new weapon types, oxygen tanks to let you breathe underwater, and so much more. Night Runner mode makes Dying Light more akin to an RPG, and finding a rare item or unlocking a useful skill is much more rewarding. Instead of drowning the player in survivor XP, quests now offer entirely new rewards for beating them, whether that's weapons, blueprints or consumables. This makes gameplay far less repetitive and predictable, and you never know what you'll stumble upon. During your travels, you'll notice the weather is a lot more unpredictable. There are now over 100 weather variations that can occur at any point, engulfing Haran in dense fog or deafening the nearby moans of zombies with pouring rain. This may tempt you to take shelter inside and venture into a quarantine zone, but in Night Runner they are even more inhospitable, and are ranked from 1 to 10 in terms of difficulty. The moment you step foot inside a quarantine zone, you'll become infected and receive a debuff depending on the difficulty ranking, turning quarantine zones into mini roguelikes. Your movement speed might get lowered, your vision blurred, firearms disabled, and so on. But like I mentioned earlier, this is where risk versus reward comes into play. For those of you that do take on the challenge, you'll have access to Quarantine Zone exclusive lunatic chests which store some of the best items in the game, including never before seen quarantine tokens that can be converted into high level loot. But it's not just the base game that's been altered, almost every single DLC has too, including the Bozak Horde and the following, making these expansions even more expansive and catering to players who have seen everything the base campaign has to offer. Bosses, challenges, objectives, waves and rewards have all been overhauled, including one-of-a-kind unlocks only obtainable by achieving certain feats. Night Runner mode also hosts a number of subtle but surprisingly impactful changes that breathe new life into the game. Gone are the days of airdrops predictably containing flares and medical supplies every single time. There are now 7 unique bundles, each containing varied and life-saving loot such as firearms and food. Food of which is no longer consumed on the spot and is now stored in your inventory for whenever you need it, making Night Runner mode's grueling gameplay slightly more forgiving. Human combat has now been streamlined now that enemies won't parry your attacks anymore.
What is this shit?
Whilst this does simplify combat somewhat, parries were purely based on random chance and didn't make combat tougher, just time consuming, and is personally a welcome change. Lockpicking has seen changes too, and after unlocking very hard containers such as police vans, they must now be forced open with a button mashing minigame, adding another layer of desperation to looting as zombies continue shambling towards you. Fortunately, to ease the repetition of seeing the same animations over and over, opening containers has been sped up to maintain the flow of moment-to-moment gameplay. Now there is so much more I could talk about, but I'd rather you experience Night Runner mode for yourself. In my opinion, it's the way Dying Light is meant to be played, and I cannot emphasise how much this mod builds upon an already solid foundation in creative, surprising and terrifying ways, whilst retaining the essence of what makes Dying Light so special in the first place. If you're after a hardcore survival experience, Night Runner mode is exactly what you're looking for. In fact, all of the mods I discuss going forward are intended to be used over the top of Night Runner mode, and I have included compatibility patches for every mod in the description below. From a story perspective, when the events of the following take place, enough time has passed that the infection has begun to mutate. This horrific disease is now capable of transforming biters into nightwalkers during the day, and is a shocking sight when you spot something that should be shambling towards you now sprinting at full speed. As someone who loves being challenged in games, I recently took it upon myself to see if I could speed up the infection and bring it to the base game's timeline. Now this was already achieved by the fantastic modder Doc on Holiday in his I Am Legion overhaul, among many other improvements to the game. However, I wanted to see if I could implement this feature from scratch, so I spent several days banging my head against my desk figuring this out, and the results are absolutely terrifying. Especially when you download the version that doesn't just mutate biters, but ignites them. Oh my god, this is a really bad situation to be in. With this mod, any biter has a chance to mutate in front of you, which makes exploring horde-infested areas such as the Infamy Bridge that much more unsettling and life-threatening. If you're fast enough, you can finish them off with a single strike, or distance yourself from them before they turn. During mutation, biters are blinded for a brief moment, meaning you have a window of opportunity to hide. Once they finish turning, they won't suddenly know your location, even if they saw you beforehand, adding an element of stealth gameplay during the day, something usually reserved for after the sun goes down. Now this mod might not be for everyone, but it makes a DLC exclusive feature able to occur anywhere, adding a new type of threat to the streets of Iran and encouraging you not simply to run or fight, but to hide. Inspired by the film The Night Eats the World, which has a particularly frightening take on the undead by making them absolutely silent, this mod makes sound, or lack thereof, the biter's biggest strength by significantly lowering their moans and groans. In the vanilla game, biters become increasingly agitated as they approach you, and because they're technically still alive, will make distinct noises when being attacked, being set on fire, and even when falling from heights. Silent Bite strips what little soul they have left, turning them into lifeless husks. They no longer yell in pain whenever you defend yourself, instead producing a barely perceptible breath. From a purely atmospheric perspective, this makes the environment incredibly oppressive, offering absolutely no comfort and feeling like a truly dead world. Hordes of zombies, no matter how large, are barely audible, and seeing hundreds of lifeless but somehow still standing bodies in the distance instills a feeling of dread like no other. From a gameplay perspective, zombies no longer make their presence known, and all you'll have to rely on to know there's danger close is by listening out for their footsteps. Their silence is deafening, making looting and lockpicking way more tense, and you'll find yourself triple checking the coast is clear before you take your focus off what's around you, or at least you should. From a lore perspective, it really reinforces the fact they've been infected long enough for the virus to utterly consume them, and I've personally jumped out of my seat several times since making this mod. Although I wouldn't necessarily recommend it on a first playthrough, it offers a fresh take on the standard formula, and I'm pleasantly surprised how well it works, both from a difficulty and atmospheric perspective. As I mentioned earlier, volatiles are Dying Light's apex predator, but are the only enemy type that doesn't instantly recognise you as a snack. Not only that, your character has a sort of sixth sense when it comes to volatiles, and is immediately able to tell whenever a volatile is looking at him and from which direction. This balancing gives players time to break their line of sight before almost certain evisceration, but something that always took me out of the moment was the sound effect that plays whenever they spot you. I totally get why it's there, but after playing Dying Light for over 100 hours, it started to get a little repetitive. Split into two parts, sound and sight, whenever you enter a volatile's cone of vision, either the warning sound will no longer play, or the icon pointing in the volatile's direction will no longer display. And if you choose to install both, the only way you will be able to tell is by listening out for the volatile's distinct guttural growl whenever you get close. Because the icon is removed, not only won't it inform you which direction you're being observed from anymore, but you won't know how long you have left to hide until the volatile decides to make you its next meal. couple of years ago, modder GrewMod released Overgrowth, a simple yet transformative mod that increases the scale of Haran's vegetation, allowing nature to reclaim its rightful throne. Unfortunately, this mod only affects the slums map, with Old Town being left untouched. Nature Reclaimed follows in Overgrowth's footsteps, impacting both the slums and Old Town, as well as featuring even denser vegetation for a real Last of Us feel. But you might be wondering how an aesthetic mod has anything to do with difficulty, but you'd be surprised. Parts of the environment are so thick with foliage that it obscures what lies beyond, and I've personally been caught off guard a few times. Going off the beaten path is much tenser now, and you must really stay on your toes to avoid the undead's hands-on approach. Old Town, whilst being primarily comprised of tall buildings and narrow streets, has a surprising amount of greenery, which makes exploring this location just as unnerving as the slums, making the world feel even more desolate and emphasising the total collapse of society. Split into two parts as optional add-ons, Human Movement alters both climbing and combat to provide a more grounded experience. One of Dying Light's biggest selling points, especially when compared to its predecessor Dead Island, is its fluid parkour system, allowing you to outrun pursuing infected and explore the world with far greater verticality. This innovative mechanic makes traversal incredibly fun, but I always felt Crane was a little too fleet-footed. Human Movement does exactly what the name implies and affects the way you navigate the environment in small but meaningful ways. Movement acceleration is increased slightly, meaning that reaching full speed takes a moment longer. By default, you have this unnatural ability to stop and start moving mid-air as many times as you like, and are able to position yourself perfectly over safe landings at the last moment. This makes movement feel very responsive, but is far too forgiving. With Human Movement installed, you still have a level of air control, but you can no longer unrealistically change directions or go from a stationary to sprinting speed until your feet are actually touching the ground. The speed at which you sprint has also been lowered very slightly. You can still keep a safe distance between you and the infected, but you're slightly less hedgehog and a bit more human now. Lastly, your maximum jump height has also been affected in a couple of ways. You now jump slightly lower by default. You can still reach the same ledges, but you'll need to get a bit closer before making the jump, meaning that if a zombie is chasing you, its attack has a little bit more time to connect before you can jump away from its grasp. Secondly, when you're out of breath, you'll no longer be able to scale entire walls. You can still climb onto cars and ledges to separate the distance, but being cornered is a bigger concern now. The goal of this mod is to add a sense of weight and consequences to your actions, with escaping danger being a bit more involved now. It's not a drastic change, but it feels more like you're rooted in this world and less like you're gliding across the landscape with superhuman agility. And now onto the second part of the mod, combat. Lots of players enjoy the power fantasy of going from being a struggling survivor into a zombie slaying machine. I too enjoy this from time to time, but there comes a point where I get bored of being overpowered. And when it comes to physics, I like combat to feel visceral and heavy. Whenever you now do a charged attack or dropkick a zombie, instead of them flying back a considerable distance, they don't travel nearly as far now. This adds weight and impact to every strike and makes you feel a lot more human, especially when paired with realistic traversal. Zombies will rise to their feet closer to where they were initially standing, and if you're fighting several zombies at once, you'll have to create more space between you or risk being overwhelmed. You won't be able to dance around your enemies nearly as effectively, and will find yourself looking for environmental hazards and relying on traps more in order to get the upper hand. I love Dying Light's grapple system, but as much as I enjoy throwing zombies off buildings and watching them plummet to the street below, something that's always bothered me a bit is just how far you can throw them. Yeah, it's satisfying, but it's not very realistic, so I decided to edit the physics in a few ways. First of all, did you know that the developers actually programmed a front push as well as behind into the side? It's just not enabled by default. Well, this mod brings it back, and it's so much fun. Ragdolls behave more realistically now, and your enemies won't fly away when grappled. Instead, they slam to the ground thanks to the heavier physics. And when they do hit the ground, more friction is applied, meaning enemies don't slide along surfaces as much, adding a feeling of weight to every impact. Much like The Last of Us's melee combat, you can use the environment to your advantage more effectively now because of how much harder and faster they fall, making it a lot easier to smash them into cars, walls, windows, shelves, you name it. Oh, and enemies no longer have invisible dumbbells weighing them down, and don't insist on falling headfirst from heights anymore, and will now fall as you'd expect them to. Perhaps a minor mod in the grand scheme of things, but for those that like physics to feel more grounded and lifelike, with less of a disparity between your abilities and your enemies, Human Movement was made for you. This isn't actually a single mod I'll be covering, rather there are 4 simple but effective mods that I use alongside one another to enhance immersion and get rid of unnecessary sound effects. The first is mute viral banging noise by Stinvek and does exactly what the name implies. By default, whenever a loud noise occurs, such as when firing a gun, blowing something up, or a zombie blowing themselves up, the deafening sound of a viral yelling in the distance will play to inform you they're on their way. Now, if this happened every once in a while, it wouldn't be a big deal, but the sound plays every single time something loud happens, even if you're stood in the middle of nowhere. Muting that sound leaves you second guessing whether they'll arrive, making their eventual appearance much more unexpected and meaningful. The second mod, Mute Charged Attacks, silences the bizarre digital echo that plays whenever you land a strong attack on an enemy. It's obviously there to enhance the feeling of impact, but I don't know why the developers went with such an out-of-place sound. Dying Light already has a ton of meaty, impactful sound effects, and in my opinion this noise doesn't benefit the game at all, it just makes it worse. With this mod, that sound is removed, which I'd argue actually gives charged attacks more impact now that the sound of smacking a zombie across their head with a baseball bat isn't being muffled by the sound of a UFO taking off. Thirdly, we have the No Night Loop mod, which removes this eerie background sound whenever you're out during nighttime. Don't get me wrong, it definitely adds to the creepy factor, but after a while it becomes hugely repetitive. Now, this mod was originally made by Zed Danman, but a recent update must have broken this mod, so I spent a bit of time figuring out how to recreate it for the current patch. With the noise disabled, the environment immediately sounds more atmospheric. The sound of trees blowing in the wind, crickets chirping, and distant zombie moans now taking centre stage. And last but not least, the No Spend Reminder mod. Dying Light has some insanely fun abilities to play with, but I find in the vanilla game, less so with Night Runner mode, you reach a point where you're almost unstoppable. For me at least, the moment a game stops being difficult is the moment I start losing interest. I purposely don't buy overpowered abilities that trivialise gameplay. Unfortunately, however, Dying Light has a spend reminder sound effect that regularly plays, prompting you to purchase an ability. As the name suggests, No Spend Reminder says goodbye to this sound, and now you'll simply be reminded to level up via the on-screen prompt, which is miles more subtle. And there you have it, 7 mods that overhaul Dying Light in both minor and massive ways, cementing its place in the survival horror genre and offering a fresh experience for seasoned Dying Light veterans. I love Dying Light, and it is already fairly challenging, but these mods make you less of a god among zombies and demand you keep your wits about you, especially when playing on the incredible Night Runner mode. I cannot recommend it enough. You'll be placed in entirely new scenarios, be encouraged to explore using all the tools at your disposal, and interact with the game's many mechanics on a more intimate level. I really hope you enjoyed watching, and since you made it to the end, please do consider subscribing for upcoming gaming news, reviews and interviews. I'll also be covering tons of mods and overhauls too, so if there's any you'd like me to talk about in particular, please do let me know in the comments below. I'm Tom with Game Cartel, thank you very much again for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Have a great day.